Well, welcome back to another session of the 126 Collective. I'm excited for today's session. I've already taught it like 3 or 4 times just to clients, so that worked out pretty good. I got a head start there, but I'm excited about this one because I'll tell you guys, up until now and in the future, I will always do my best to make these lessons as broadly receivable as possible. And by that, I mean, I'm not trying to hide my faith journey in any of this, but I also want this to be palatable. I want it to be something that someone who may not consider themselves a believer, I want them to be able to receive these teachings. And obviously, from a, I guess, a more subversive standpoint, it is like, you hear the message enough, you see that there's enough value in scripture. And maybe even if you're not a believer, you're like, maybe I should dig a little bit deeper. So certainly don't want to hide that, but I also want to make it as broadly appealing as possible. It was hard to do with this one because I personally had a great awakening or understanding in preparing for this lesson that I'm excited to share with you today. So we're going to talk about Josiah, and Josiah was one of the kings of Israel, and I thought I had which one he was, but this Josiah began his reign at 640 BC. The boy was 8 years old. So it's interesting that someone who became the leader of an entire nation at the tender age of 8 years old became one of the few in his position to actually do some good. So we'll talk about that. But so we're going to be reading today from the book of Second Kings or Two Kings, chapters 22 and 23. And so what I want to start by saying, and let me go ahead, I'm assuming you guys probably got the um, the handout, but I'm going to share that anyway, is that, I believe that every leader wants transformation. I've been working with leaders full time for about 16 years now. That kind of just blows my mind that I've been doing this for this long, but have been working with leaders and been in a leadership position myself, really back to the 80s. I'm old, so it's kind of interesting. But I've never come across a leader who was truly a leader. Now, I've met managers. You know the difference, right, between leaders and managers. And I've met managers who were happy with the way things were, but I've never met a leader who didn't desire transformation at some level. And part of that is just because I believe that, they're constantly growing. And so there's never a 10 on anything. Like there's always room to grow. So the truth is, I believe that we do want stronger teams. We want healthier cultures. We want better employee engagement, performance, all of those things. I do believe we want that. And yet, I believe that many leaders make the mistake of trying to make change in the organization before they allow change to happen in themselves. And so when I wrote that sentence, it was because I had come under a very deep understanding that there's a very big difference between creating change and allowing change. And so this was the part that was truly for me this week. And if nobody had shown up today, I would still be teaching this lesson because I think it's a powerful one to learn. So, we're going to talk about sustainable transformation. And as I have on the handout here, Josiah's story reminds us that sustainable transformation is always an inside out process. It's always inside out. So leaders who skip this inner work will, I believe, struggle to create lasting change in the people that they're leading. So, what I want to say about this is I don't know if any of you have ever been part of an organization where the let's say it's a company where they bring in some consultants to do some, I don't even know what it's really called, but I've been a part of it on two separate occasions in business where they bring in these consultants who come in and they're like gonna help us create our mission statement, or our values and our vision. And in one point, I was a bank teller early on, and I had moved into the position of top trainer. So I had a little classroom, and I taught all the new tellers, and I trained all the people that sit on the desk and the platform. I know they don't really have a lot of that anymore, but at the time, that was part of the banking world. And at one point, they brought in this consultant, and we spent like a week in the evenings, and we did all of this skits and role play. We had talent shows, like it was super fun, and we created little videos. And so it was there trying to help build morale and sort of create some better systems around things. And it was so much fun. I loved it. I was all in. I'm a high eye on the disc. Like, let's go. Like, let's create this. And at the end, we had our little hoorah session and had a dinner and a party and all of that. And they showed the videos, and each department kind of created a how to do things better, but in a funny way video. Anyway, this was the whole thing. And it was fabulous. And then when it was over, it was over. And so we were right back to the way things always were. Like nothing really changed. It was very frustrating. Fast forward, I don't know, 10, 12 years, maybe 15, and I'm working for another financial institution. And now I'm a vice president. And they bring in this company who's going to come in, and all the VPs are sitting around, and we're all brainstorming and coming up with our vision, and we're going to get t-shirts, the whole thing. And half the time, the CEO wasn't even there. He wasn't even in the room. So we go through the week of this, everybody's sitting around the table, and we come up with this great mission and vision statements. We're going to put them on a poster in the break room and all that good stuff. And when it was over, nothing changed. Nothing changed. Now, when I go back and reflect on both of those things, what I realize is that it's because the people in charge, the leaders, they weren't changing. They weren't changing. They hired people to change their team, but they weren't willing to change. And they certainly didn't allow change. Now I fast forward, I get into business for myself. And in 2012, I attended my first Tony Robbins event. And honestly, the first one was like, rah, rah, I am all in. And I went home and nothing changed. Now, lucky for me, Tony is not the kind of guy that's going to let you go once he's got you in the database. And so about 8 months later, I decided to go back. And at that point, I was all in. And I dramatically changed. You would not recognize me physically. You would not recognize me financially. You would not recognize me from a mindset. All of that stuff did change. And I was able to create a lot of change and a lot of success as a result of that. But here's what I was still missing. And it's the word allow. So you can circle it, underline it, highlight it. And this is where I'm telling you, I can't leave my faith out of this lesson, because there's something dramatic that happened when I allowed change to happen in me, right? I had seen change happen on the outside, but nobody changed on the inside. I had seen temporary change. I had seen like big change. Like I made a lot of changes. I don't regret any of that, by the way. But there's something happened when I surrendered my life to Jesus that changed me on the inside. It's no longer me. I thought it was me. I was like arm wrestling myself to the ground, discipline, focus, drive. I would get up and do the reps, and I could, build incredible muscle, but it was still an effort. It was still an effort. And the difference now is that I've allowed change to happen on the inside of me. So that is huge. And I believe that that is one of the lessons that Josiah can teach us. And I will say this, even just showing up for these, whether you do one or two or more, the more that you show up and engage in this process, it doesn't have anything to do with me. I'm just here delivering, I'm just praying to be a good mouthpiece. But the more that you show up and just even consider some of the things that we discuss in the 126 Collective, change will happen if you allow it. If you allow it. I always want to give you action steps, right? I mean, I want your feet to hit the streets and do some work. But I do believe that just being here and engaging in these kinds of conversations and listening to these kinds of teachings will allow you to allow some of that change to happen in yourself. And so that's what I really want to talk about. And I'll make one more side note. If you've ever watched Tony do some of his work, he does these incredible interventions with people that can seem to create this incredible change in just 90 minutes or 2 hours. But a little behind the scenes fact is when he does those interventions, those people get assigned a coach to stay with them to make sure that it sticks, right? You could go to, let's say you go to a seminar and it's about, I don't know, getting in shape. And you're like, I'm in, I'm going to go to the gym and I'm going to hire a trainer and I'm going to get in shape and I'm going to call this nutritionist and all these things are exciting in the moment. And then you get home and the law of diminishing intent says the farther away you get from the site of setting a goal before you take action, the less likely you ever are to take action. So even though it seems like magic when Tony does his work, he also knows I got to get these people with somebody who can walk them through the process. I think we're all the same. So let's talk about Josiah. And this is going to be from 2 Kings or 2 Kings chapter 22 verses 1 through 2. Josiah was 8 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 31 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Jedidah, the daughter of Adiah of Bozkath. And he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord and walked in all the way of David his father, and he did not turn aside to the right or to the left. Now, David is not his father. He's his, great, great, great here. But that's how a biblical lineage is. We are meant to know he is from the line of David. And so when Josiah took the throne, he took the throne in a time of utter depravity. There was so much immorality, there was so much chaos. And this is because his grandfather Manasseh had reigned for 50 years and just completely the wheels came off the wagon. There was so much corruption, idolatry, sexual immorality. People were sacrificing their children in the fires to false gods. And this is how Josiah takes the throne in the midst of all this. At 8 years old, he decides he's going to follow Yahweh. Now, by the way, worship of Yahweh had almost disappeared at this point. There was so much immorality and corruption and idolatry that, very few people even remembered who Yahweh was. So by the time Josiah is 16 years old, he has decided that he's going to follow Yahweh. Now we've got 8 years, right? Part of what is happening in Josiah is that he's changing. And part of what he does at some point when he is 22 years old is he decides he's going to restore the temple so that he can restore true worship of Yahweh. So his secretary is Shaphan. And Shaphan, while the temple is being restored, one of the priests discovers the book of the law. Imagine that, you bought an old building, you want to restore it, and then you find, and you want to make it into a church of some God that you think you understand, and then you find the Bible. That's essentially what happened here. And so when Shaphan brings the book of the law, which remember is the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the law, the books of Moses, when it was read aloud, Josiah falls apart and he tears his clothes. So 2 Kings 22 verse 11 says, when the king heard the words of the book of the law, he tore his clothes. That's a sign of true just mourning. Like you're just so distraught. You just tear your clothes, right? And so this was not Josiah's attempt to look good, to make some sort of political statement. It was his realization that that not only was he to follow Yahweh, but that there was a way prescribed to do that. And so he understood he had to lead himself before he could possibly go and lead his people and ask them to change. And he's at this point got 8+ years of work being changed on the inside. So he sends his advisors to the prophetess Huldah to ask her, like, can you confirm, right? Is this what's happening? Because obviously the prophets had been, as they always did, warning Judah that God is going to let them be handed over to experience the consequences of their choices, right? God's wrath was less about him punishing them than letting them experience the punishment that they had brought on themselves. So this is what Huldah says in 2 Kings 22, verses 18 and 19. But to the king of Judah, who sent you to inquire of the Lord, thus shall you say to him, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, regarding the words that you have heard, Because your heart was penitent and you humbled yourself before the Lord when you heard how I spoke against this place and against its inhabitants, that they should become a desolation and a curse. And you have torn your clothes and wept before me. I also have heard you, declares the Lord. So, what God is commending in Josiah is not who he is as king, but he commends his humility and how he responded to the Lord. So before God used Josiah to influence the entire nation, he first shaped his heart. You've probably heard it said a lot in the Old Testament. God says, I will take your heart of stone and replace it with a heart of flesh. And so this is what's happening to young Josiah. So my leadership truth here is in order to lead others, you got to lead yourself. And this is where I love John Maxwell's law of the picture. People do what people see. Now, this is why, by the way, in the bank and the financial institution that I worked for, that's why nothing changed. Because we did what we saw, and what we saw was not change. What we saw was a lot of talk and no action. And so if you have children or you know someone who does, you know this all too well. Children do what they see in their parents, not what their parents say. Like a lot of us grew up with parents who smoked. At least my age, pretty much everybody smoked. But so a lot of my friends smoked, even though their parents told them not to smoke. I mean, people do what people see. We all know that. I look at my grandkids, and we want them to have a cleaner mouth than unfortunately we have had. We're praying on that, by the way. I'm like, God, you fixed a lot of things in me. Like you can have my language, but you're going to have to take that one because I've been a sloppy talker for most of my life. I was raised on a pirate ship, I used to say. But anyway, it's the same thing with my grandkids. We can say, you shouldn't say these things. But if they hear mom and dad say certain things, even if it's not a cuss word, but it's just something that's not kind, that's what they're going to repeat. Um, I can send you a video of my grandson when he was 3 if you want proof of that. But anyway, we think it's funny now, but it was not funny at the time. People do what people see. So culture is not shaped by what leaders say. It's shaped by what they model. And so you know this. If you've ever been a part of a team or part of an organization, it doesn't matter, how if it's a volunteer organization, community organization, or with work. We watch how leaders respond to adversity. We absolutely do. We watch how they handle failure. We want to see what are they prioritizing? What do they tolerate? So we want people, all of us do it. We watch whether leaders are willing to submit themselves to the same standards they expect from everybody else. There's not a week that goes by that I'm not having conversations with clients about their standards. And are you holding yourself to the same standards that you're expecting your clients, that you're expecting your team members to uphold? It's a lot harder to demand accountability from people if you're not walking the talk, as they say, right? We know that. And so a lot of times in the work that I've done with people over the years, a lot of the reason why they don't get the same results out of their teammates is because they don't hold them accountable. And we have to do some digging to find out if the reason that they're not holding them accountable is because they themselves don't want to be held accountable. Like that's an ugly truth to wake up to, but it's a good one to understand. If you're not getting out of your people what you want, maybe it's not because they're the wrong people. Maybe it's because you're not holding yourself to that same standard. People are watching, right? And people do what people see. So leaders need to understand this. But when you're leading from level 1, which is positional leadership, you do what I say because I say to do it. I mean, how well does that work with your average 8-year-old, right? So it definitely doesn't work with adults. So people watch, right? Our kids watch, our team members watch, our colleagues and coworkers watch. And I think Josiah understood this instinctively. So he had to align himself with God's law, if you will, before he could ask others to commit to changing. And so his influence flowed from his example rather than his position. And I think that's the only way to do it. So Albert Schweitzer once said, example isn't the main thing in leadership, it's the only thing. It's the only thing. So this is, I think, a reality that every leader is going to eventually discover that what you model is what you're going to get out of your people. So in terms of leadership, I think this is huge for us to understand. And I think the key distinction I get from Josiah is, yes, he put the effort into changing. He was rebuilding the temple. He was beginning to study the law. He did go out and do the things. He eradicated the idolatry, the worship of false idols. He got rid of all the temple prostitutes and everything that was going on. He stopped the sacrificing of children. He did have to do all of those things, but it came because he had allowed the change to begin within himself. It's a lot easier, right? Because he's now walking the talk. And so, um, transformational leadership, I think, is when personal change becomes public influence, right? Personal change becomes public influence. So now it starts to spread. So we go on to 2 Kings chapter 23, verses 1 through 3. Then the king sent, and all the elders of Judah and Jerusalem were gathered to him. And the king went up to the house of the Lord, and with him all the men of Judah and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and the priests and the prophets, all the people, both small and great. And he read in their hearing all the words of the book of the covenant that had been found in the house of the Lord. And the king stood by the pillar and made a covenant before the Lord to walk after the Lord and to keep his commandments and his testimonies and his statutes with all his heart and all his soul, to perform the words of this covenant that were written in this book. And all the people joined in the covenant. So it's a very distinct timeline here. 8 years old, he wants something different than what his father and grandfather had. He feels that call. He begins to devote himself. And then 6 years later, he discovers the book of the law and he begins to study it and he begins to absorb it and he allows that change to happen in him. Then he starts to make the change in the world around him. Then he calls the people together. And when he reads this to them, the groundwork has been laid. They're able to receive it. And they joined him in that covenant. So you got to look at the sequence there. He didn't start with outward change. He started with reflection, right? So when you see the change on the outside, it's simply because the change has already taken place within him. So let's look at this pattern of transformational leadership. So as I studied this, I wanted to know, what are the steps? Because what makes this applicable is if we can now take it into our lives and figure out, well, if I want to make some changes in my organization, right? And again, whether you lead a team or whether what your leadership is of your clients and your your business partners, whatever it might be, whether you lead a volunteer team or you're leading a family, like I think this sequence matters. And the first one is awareness. Awareness. The first one is that Josiah encountered truth, right? And so good leaders, great leaders, are willing to face reality even when it's uncomfortable. And I would suggest maybe that if we're not finding uncomfortable realities to face and challenging truths to face, that we're probably not digging deep enough. We're just playing it too safe. So it started with awareness, right? There's a quote I use all the time, and honestly, I don't know where it comes from, and it's this: choice is a function of awareness. Choice is a function of awareness. So step 2 is alignment. So rather than ignoring what he learned, he adjusted himself first, right? So again, he had to be willing to change, or as I've discovered, he has to be willing, we have to be willing to be allowed to change. We have to allow that change to happen before we can ask others to change. So he had to get into alignment. And then third step is action. So only after he became aware and he allowed that alignment to happen in his life did he begin leading transformation on the outside. So by this time, the public changes that everyone saw were simply that. They were a visible outcome of the internal decision that had already been made. It was easy. Now let's just think about this for a minute, because you can think about what would have to happen if you wanted to force the change, right? We've all tried to force change, have we not? I mean, am I the only one that's tried to force change? I've done it. I've done it in myself and in others. By the way, I tried to force my kids to change. Of course, all the usual. Husbands, anybody ever tried to force their husband to change? Yep, done all those things. But the truth is that anything that we try to any change we try to force on ourselves or others that is not coming from this place of awareness and alignment will always be something. I heard it said recently about the it's like trying to hold a beach ball under the water. You can only do that for so long before that thing is going to come out. And if you think about, if you hold a beach ball under the water, when you let it go, it doesn't just pop to the surface, it explodes out of the water. So I think that's what happens when we try to force change. It doesn't work, it doesn't last, it's too hard, and eventually it's going to blow up in our face, especially if we're trying to force change in others and we haven't changed ourselves first or been changed. And so I think it's refreshing to know that if we become aware of the things in us that need to be changed, of the truths that we need to align ourselves with, and we get right in ourselves first, then what happens outside of us is just the natural. And so, when that happens, we're not now forcing the change. Other people are being changed as they've watched us be changed. I could tell you in my marriage, there has been some pretty dramatic changes in the last couple of months. And Danielle knows this all too well. Danielle was my coach for a very long time. I was trying to force a lot of changes. And when I finally decided I was going to start focusing on myself and allowing God to change me, my marriage changed. And now there's changes in my husband that, if you didn't know him, I mean, if you knew him, you would be absolutely shocked. But it's because now it's just this natural progression. As I've allowed myself to be changed, I've given him permission to do the same. And so now these changes that have happened in our marriage, and we had a great marriage, but I'm just telling you, we'll write a book on it one of these days and you'll be blown away, hopefully. But it's because of this allowing change instead of trying to force change. You picking up what I'm putting down here? Yeah, it's totally different. And so I love that. The public changes were simply, underline the word simply, because it is much simpler this way. The visible outcome of an internal decision that had already been made. And I love that. That's my key focus there. So why does this matter? Well, we have all been a part of an organization where, or at least I think most people have been part of an organization where you've seen leadership efforts fail dramatically. I mean, maybe you weren't. I mean, has anybody ever been part of an organization where there was a failure in leadership? I mean, if every hand doesn't go up, you haven't been in the world long enough, I guess. Yeah. I mean, we've all seen it, and it's tragic. It's really tragic. But I think it's because so many times people think, well, I'm the leader and I need these changes to happen. I'm working with a team right now. It's a real estate team, and we're hiring essentially we'll call it a director of operations, but really a right hand. I hate that they demonize the word secretary, because I worked for some big companies, and the secretary to the CEO, that girl, and it was always a girl, that girl, she was the wheel in the cog, she was the spoke, she was the engine, she was everything. I've worked with these women that, I'm telling you, they could run circles around anybody in the company. They really kept it all together. I hate that we vilified that term. Nobody wants to be a secretary anymore. Well, this is what this team needs. They need that woman that can come in and just, make it all work and make it all work. And they've tried it before. And the difference is today, in this season that they're in, since they've started coaching with me. It's like that's we're done with that. We're no longer going to hire people and expect them to do something we're not willing to do ourselves. We're not going to hire people that we can then just dump all the stuff we don't want to do on their plate and expect them to do it. We're not hiring somebody to cut the grass, okay? If you hire somebody to cut the grass, you probably have some pretty, standards, but they sort of cut the grass and then the grass is cut and they weed and they're done. We're not hiring that. We're hiring a business partner, somebody who really is going to help move this thing forward. And so the conversation that we've been having on our calls lately is you got to walk the talk. You got to lead yourself and you got to be willing to be accountable and hold them accountable. And that's going to make the difference. And they are all in. They are committed. And that has become their prayer. Like, help us to be the leaders that we would want to follow. Right. And that's powerful. And so you can't demand accountability from your team if you're not willing to model that same level of accountability, if you're not willing to create the same disciplines. You can't expect your people to trust you if you're not demonstrating integrity. And look, I get it. We all think we're integrous and, we do the right thing and we tell the truth and all of that. But integrity goes deeper. It's one of those words people can't really define, but you know when it's not there. You know what I mean? Some things, like if I said define beauty, it's a little nebulous, but you know when it's not there, right? We all know that. And same thing with integrity. So you got to demonstrate integrity. That's at all levels. You can't expect your people to make a commitment if you're not willing to show them how you will sacrifice to live up to your commitments. And you've got to be transformed personally if you want it to show on the outside. Most people understand that when you walk into a Chick-fil-A, I don't know if they're everywhere, but I think most people understand when you walk into a Chick-fil-A, it's not like walking into a McDonald's. Now, that doesn't mean that somebody couldn't own a McDonald's and create that same culture, but it's that culture of Chick-fil-A that started at the very top that makes Chick-fil-A as successful as it is. Total side note, have you seen any of these videos of people that are coming to America for the World Cup and they're experiencing the America that we take for granted? Some of the funniest ones I've seen are Chick-fil-A. They are losing their ever-loving mind over a Chick-fil-A chicken sandwich. It blows my mind. But what's going on behind the counter at Chick-fil-A because you see what's going on in front of the counter, at the counter, right? And so we know that cultural transformation doesn't happen unless it starts at the very top. So sustainable change has to begin with the leader, right? And this is the truth. We'll all comply with authority for a while, but ultimately, you know that I've left companies because of the lack of integrity at leadership in the leadership. Both of those companies that I mentioned that I was with, I left ultimately not because of money or because of position. I see Danielle, you were a bank teller at one point too. That's hilarious. Yeah, I mean, we've had our banking days, but I left those companies ultimately because of the leadership of those companies. And what in one instance, the bank that I went to work for ultimately was not the bank I left, but it was because banking back in the 80s and 90s, each bank was like Pac-Man. They were just gobbling up all the other banks. And the bigger they got, sometimes the leadership began to suffer. So I think that's important for us to remember. So this Josiah's impact was so important. Wait a minute, I'm thinking we just lost Danielle. Let me see if she wants to hop back in. Yep. All right, well, she'll hop back in a minute. But anyway, Josiah's leadership impact was so significant that Scripture gives him one of the most important things we've ever seen recorded about a king, and that's this from 2 Kings 23, verse 25. Before him there was no king like him, who turned to the Lord with all his heart and with all his soul and with all his might. Now that's some pretty powerful words, especially considering that before him, David was king. Before him, Saul was king. Before him, Solomon was king. Now, we know that Saul started out to be a great king and eventually, fell. We know that David started out, and we ultimately know that David was a man after God's own heart because David, it's not that David never made mistakes, but that he was truly penitent, he was truly repentant, he was truly humble, and he trusted God. But David had his problems as well. And then certainly we know Solomon, who started out, boy, he was doing great, man. Prayed for wisdom above all else and received it, but then, his ego got the best of him too. So even with those three powerful men in his past, the Bible says there was no king like him before him who turned to the Lord with all his heart, with all his soul, and with all of his might. And I think that's an incredible lesson for us as well. Like, are we willing, no matter where we stand, from a business standpoint, from a community standpoint, from a financial standpoint, from a leadership standpoint? Are we willing to give it all, to lay it all down at the feet of the Lord and let Him be ultimately the leader that we follow? And so Josiah is our example that when you do that, you can actually create some pretty incredible change. So, um, Josiah's leadership legacy wasn't built on his title, right? And so my last point here is influence grows when leaders embody the change that they hope to see, right? Influence grows when leaders embody the change that they want to see. And so I think that is the challenge for all of us to like Gandhi said, be the change you want to see in the world. So I got another quote from former Secretary of State General Colin Powell. He was general, right? You can issue all the memos and give all the motivational speeches you want, but if the rest of the people in your organization don't see you putting forth your very best effort every single day, they won't either. Right. So, even though scripture records that there was no king like him before him, um, who turned to the Lord with all his heart, with all his soul, and with all of his might. We still are, we never hear that Josiah was like very charismatic or this he was a great speaker or like some military strategist. We don't hear any of that about him. And yet he gets one of the highest praises that you could get in a book of the Bible, that he turned to God. And so his life matched his message. And so his words carried weight because they were supported by everything that he was and everything that he did. And so that credibility comes because people could see that he had changed before he even asked them to embrace it. And I think that is it's so huge and it's such a great lesson for each and every one of us. So let's talk about why his leadership worked. We've already we beat this horse till it's dead. He modeled what he wanted. His personal renewal became a public picture. It was his example. People do what people see. So I want you to just take a couple of minutes here and think about some of these questions. And again, this could be in your business. It could be with your own team. It could be with your clients. It could be with your family, maybe your community, church, some place where you are in a position of leadership. Now, whether it's an official position, like you have a title to go with it, or you just consider yourself a leader in this area, or you see that there's a need for you to step up and lead in this area. Where is there a gap between the culture that you want in this team and the example that you're providing? I think that's super important for each of us to think about that. Where are the gaps in our leadership? That's where to start. John Maxwell has written some incredible books on leadership. He's sort of the guru, if you will, of leadership. And my two favorites are the 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership, which kind of walks you through these 21 laws. Notice he says laws. It's like gravity. It's a law because it works, at least on Earth, right? And then my next favorite is the 5 levels of leadership. because what he does in that book is he really, and that one I reference every single week, is how you go up this ladder of the levels of leadership. And in both of those works, what you're going to be challenged to do is look for the gaps. I don't need to learn all 21 laws, but if I gave you a list of the 21 laws with the one sentence descriptor, like the law of the picture, people do what people see, you could just take one and work on it for a week. You could probably take one and work on it for a month, maybe a year. That would be better than trying to do all 21 at once. So for this question, where is there a gap between what you want and what you're doing? That's one thing to focus on. Okay. And the second question is, what truth do you need to confront? What truth do I need to confront before I ask others to change? I'm telling you, this was a huge one for me in my marriage. My husband and I are both leaders in this relationship. He leads differently and in different areas than I do. But we made a decision years ago when I was trying to step out of the role of always being the man. I was really good at it, and I've done it, most of my whole life, thanks to my single mom who raised me to be a boss lady. I love her for that, but it also caused a lot of pain in my life. But I was trying to really find my way back into what does it mean to truly be in my feminine and to truly share and be led, because I wasn't good at being led. And so I was really trying to do that. But in some areas, I'm like, this is just an area where I need to lead. And so for me, it's travel. Like I love to travel. If that was one of the love languages, that would be definitely be mine. But when I tried to step back and let my husband lead and travel, it was a miserable experience because he hates travel. He just does it because he knows I want to do it. Because ultimately, I'm wired by a need for variety, and I love quality time with him. So we just made that decision. I'm like, I'll be the man in travel, which means I get to say, you go over here, do that, pick this up. Don't forget to do that. Where are you? Just follow me. Like, and we made that decision so it didn't feel like I was emasculating him by trying to boss him around in the airport or any part of travel, and it worked out. But a big part of our marriage has been me facing some truths about what leadership really is and how to co-lead and how to be led, how to share. Wasn't good at that. So before I could ask him to change, I had to be willing to be changed. And those are the things I think in my marriage, I'm just giving you that as an example, that over time have paid the biggest dividends for me in my life for sure. Okay, next question. Are my people experiencing my values or just hearing about them? Remember all those posters you'd see if you ever had a corporate job, you probably saw them hanging around like the little cat, hanging on the limb, hang in there, or like success. And it's like some guy leaping off of a side of a mountain or something, those one word motivational posters. And they're like hanging all over the office or the break room, and none of that's happening, you know. So are your people experiencing your values or they just hear about them? It's a very big difference. All right, next question. What behaviors am I unintentionally teaching through my example? Yikes, right? I got a client right now. Man, I had to give him John Maxwell's quote. John Maxwell says that the best experience, I'm sorry, the best excuse you've ever had is the worst because you actually believe it. Well, I got to get my son to baseball camp, and it's more important that I'm with my son, and I'm gonna need to be there and show him that I'm a full-on dad, blah blah blah. Like, wow, that's amazing. Like baseball camp is what, 24 hours a day, 5 days a week? But it was a real confrontation moment because then you can't expect your team to not also come up with their own excuses of why they haven't done what you've asked them to do this week. Like that's more about how you're spending your time than whether or not you're a good dad. Let's just be honest. So what behaviors are you unintentionally teaching through example? And if my team, my family, or my organization became exactly like me, would the culture improve? That's a good one. That's a good one. I mean, if the answer is yes, hallelujah. But if the answer is no, then I think it's time to consider, right? So our final takeaway here is the most powerful leadership tool. It's not authority or vision or strategy or position. Those things are important, right? Somebody's got to lead. Somebody's got to lead. You've got to have a vision for where you're going. My goodness, we've talked about that plenty of times in the 126 Collective. You got to have some good strategies. I mean, I get paid. Part of my job is helping people, create better strategies for success and position. If you don't have people who are willing to follow you, you're just taking a walk, right? If you're just out there walking and there ain't nobody with you, you're just taking a walk. So you got to have followers. You need a position, but the most powerful leadership tool is example. Example, right? And so, once Josiah had his heart changed, then he changed the way that he led his people, and then the culture changed. Remember, he's demanding change, he's expecting change, he's creating change, he's facilitating change, and he's in his 20s. He's a kid. He's a kid. And by the way, fighting an uphill battle because it was a pretty corrupt world that he walked into. So bottom line is here, guys, people do what people see. So, it's a powerful lesson, I think. It was very important for me. I want to reiterate again about this allowing change and how it changed everything for me. So, oh, Kristen just wrote a note here. My 8-year-old granddaughter will be baptized this Sunday, and this lesson is a great lesson for her to know. Yes, her peers and others will be watching her actions, words, and deeds. Yeah, it's so important. And I think, it kind of goes into a little bit of Abigail that we talked about on our last session with your granddaughter. It's calling her up, you know, letting her know that this is about the young woman that she is becoming, that God wants to create her to be. And it definitely is calling her into a higher version of herself. But the good news is, if she's getting baptized, she won't be doing it alone. She won't be doing it alone. That she will have that Holy Spirit power to help her, and if she can remember to lean on that, she's got it made. Of course, she'll make mistakes. We all do. It's kind of funny. Somebody asked me the other day, like, if Jesus has already conquered death and sin once and for all, why do we still suffer? Why do we still suffer? And so we had a nice long conversation about why that is. We're living in the not yet but already now kind of world. The effects of sin are still out there, and I think that's the whole point. Salvation happens once, but sanctification happens the rest of our lives, and that knowing that day by day we become more and more like Him. That doesn't happen from our effort. It happens from allowing that change to happen in us. And so that's such a great message for your granddaughter, that yes, she's going to have to step up and be more mindful of how she's conducting herself. But the good news is that for the rest of her life now, that God will be there to help her become more and more like Him. That's the part. I think I might have mentioned this on a previous session, but I try to pray the Lord's Prayer slowly, 2 to 3 times a day. And a few weeks ago, I kind of had this realization, your kingdom come, your will be done. And I said, it'd be a lot easier if I just didn't have a will. Like, we just took my will out and just implanted yours in its place. We cut out the middleman. Like, I'm the middleman. I'm the one that causes problems. So it'd be a lot easier for your will to be done if I just didn't have my own. Can we make that deal? And it's like, no, that's not how it works. But, I got a late start at this. Your granddaughter's got an early start. So imagine how much change she can experience and then express to other people, for herself. Yeah. Yeah, Danielle said allowing change is huge because force is the easy button for us as humans. Like I will just, I mean, who's done it? I will arm wrestle something to the ground and make it happen. But boy, it's exhausting. It's exhausting. So anyway, I hope this has been helpful. I hope you'll share it with somebody, especially since our attendance was a little low today. I'm gonna have to remember to send out that extra email that seemed to kickstart people for them to jump on the call. But share this with somebody because I think that it's important in a culture that's all about we're going to grind and push and be more disciplined. And look, I came from that world, and I don't regret any of it. What Tony Robbins taught me about change and about success and about mindset, I wouldn't trade it for anything. But the missing piece was this. This was the missing piece that the change that's truly sustainable happens from the inside out. And then when I can lead by example, then I can affect those around me, and then they can begin to allow that change for themselves. So I'm so glad you guys tuned in today, and I will see you on our next session. Have a great week.